So this is Substance Painter. This is the sample file called MeatMat. If you want to open it up, you just go to Open Sample here. Actually, you can't see that at all. But it's under File, Open Sample, and you can open up the little MeatMat file if you want to look at this exact file. But this is just a really good one to show off a lot of how Substance Painter works. So I'll just start from the beginning, the basics. You have a 3D, 2D view. This is your UV maps here. And you also can switch between your different UV sets here. So you can hide them, do all that. And these are differentiated based on the material sets that you apply to them before you import them into Substance, which we can go over another time if you like. It's really super basic and straightforward. But then you can differentiate your different UV maps from one another and import them all as one file. Now in this file, so it already has all of its maps pre-baked. I'm just gonna unbake them to show you how that works. So in order to bake your files, if you, this is like baking normal maps onto a file, or baking the various different maps to apply your colors to based on the surface. Don't worry about quite why you're doing these things right now. Just know that these is a very, very important step in order to do things, and it'll make more sense later. So I always bake with max anti-aliasing because it just gives you a slightly higher quality. Pump up the secondary rays on ambient occlusion. And I don't know why curvature looks different. This must be an interesting file. Usually there's a secondary rays version on curvature as well, but I won't worry too much about it. And then if you have a high poly version for your low poly, what you do is you just hit this and you go ahead and look for your file, and then you hit bake. It's not really much more to it. But this will then go ahead and bake all your maps. Then you wait. But you can bake all your maps from just the low poly, and it'll just infer polygon angles from your actual mesh. To break down what all these maps are, we're baking a normal, world space normal, ID map, ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and thickness. Normal map, probably already know what that is. It changes the direction of the light that is hitting it. World space normal, I have literally never used it, but it always seems to be ticked on by default. I think it has something to do with the way position maps work, but I just trust that the system thinks it's important. ID maps usually don't need them unless you're using multi-materials on a single UV map, which isn't terribly common. If you have like ultra detailed models, you'll use ID maps, but it's not very common on all models, especially ones that aren't character models. Ambient occlusion, probably already know what that is, but it's the shadows in between here. So you'll notice it actually applies to the models that were already touching it, which you can actually change. If you don't like that applying into your map and you want it all to look sort of uniform, you can hit always ignore back facing. Some people say you should always have that on. I say that it's very situational. Sometimes if it doesn't work that way, what you have to do is you have to pull apart the individual meshes and then bake them all separately, and then take that mesh and put them all back together so that it's not sort of applying the parts that are touching to each other. But I wouldn't terribly worry about it for this specific file. So now we have a bunch of our maps. We have curvature, which is curvature, it's pretty straightforward. Thickness, which I don't find to be useful terribly often, unless you're making specifically like a plastic material or something that you're gonna fake subsurface scattering onto, um, where you can like lighten the corners and all of that, or places where it's more thick, you can darken so that it looks more plasticky in the game art style. But otherwise, it's not like a terribly useful one, so it's not always that important. 3D view only, so we can center this. And I'll delete those and just see the head. I have my interface set a little the way that I like it. I like to have my texture set list up here, my properties, layers, and display setting. I think this layout just makes the most sense to me. But you can just have it however you like. There we go. So if you've never worked with any parts of a PBR texturing set, I'll break them down really quickly. This is the basics here: color, metal, rough, normal, and height. Metal changes the Fresnel value of it, so some people often confuse it with roughness, but it's actually how if you know what like a Fresnel lens is, or what the Fresnel effect is, it focuses the light into a point rather than making it more shiny, where roughness just changes the actual reflectivity of it. So you'll see that the light becomes a lot more sharpened, so to speak. Whereas with this, it's sort of soft and all over it. So this is more, that's what metallic technically means. But just straight shininess. Roughness is roughness, pretty straightforward. Height, I can show off height better if I make a really quick thing. I'll show you. So if I increase the height on this, basically what I did is made a really quick black mask and then masked it by a cellular pattern so that it gives it this slight bit of height to it, but it's actually like faked on height. In some render engines, it will actually use this as a like real displacement based on the pixels here. And it will like anti-alias all your lines and everything, so they're not quite as jagged. But yeah, height changes the up and down of the light rather than what normal is the side to side. Height is a lot more expensive, quote unquote, for rendering purposes. So it's not always that important. Oftentimes height gets just baked into the normal map. So for especially with just game engines, because it's just incredibly taxing, and oftentimes you have to use an incredibly high poly model in order to realize a lot of that geometry. But it can look really good if you get a really solid normal map out of it. So that's just the basics of PBR. There's a bunch of other types of maps. These are the very, very basic ones. For example, you can get emissive, scattering, translucency, specularity, sheen, coat. You can map your ambient occlusion, anisotropy, tons that are unsupported, like glossiness, IOR, which if you want like max realism, you would map your IOR, which is index of refraction, reflection, specular, transmissive, which are different names for the same stuff. Yeah. So if you ever find yourself wanting a map for something that doesn't actually exist here, you can actually go into your channels here and add another map and just make another one for it. So a lot of what we do with shaders is based on the actual geometry of the model and changing colors based on that. So, oh, actually, let me take that slower. So I'm going to make a fill layer and add a black mask. And then I'm going to come up to the little magic wand here and add a curvature map. based on the curvature map that we created earlier. And this, if I just go to my base color, is gonna make a color based on the curvature of the model. And you get this little crispiness here. Let's see. It looks like there's slight noise in our curvature map. I'm not quite sure what that could be caused from, but in order to even that out, if it was a problem for me, I can just hit filter, not bevel, blur. Well, hold on. It's really strange that it did that. I could probably... No, I won't worry about it too much. You probably won't run into that on your model, and if you do, that's just a stupid problem. I'm not sure why it's doing that. So that's curvature, and I am going to make that based on that color, maybe darken it a little bit, and we'll get these darkened lines here. Based on that, maybe I'll increase the curvature a little bit. Add a little bit of blur. There are tons and tons of filters here. I'm just going to show you a couple of the basics, but I highly encourage you to explore more into them. This one's called Warp, which is really fun for breaking up the texture of a specific generator. It just sort of gives it weirdness. So that's curvature map. Really, really basic, straightforward. You do curvature. Also, probably don't need all of these other ones, just because then the first map is driving the rest of these maps, and this is just color. For the next one, I'll show you ambient occlusion, which is a really good one, especially if you're doing game art style stuff. If you just... I don't know why it's always like inverted by default, the ambient occlusion. I always have to hit invert here in order to make it look right. But it just adds a little like faked ambient occlusion into your model. And it makes it look a little, I don't know, professional, interesting looking, kind of neat. So those are the main ones that I use for pretty much everything. You can mask anything based on those two maps. So if I wanted to, like, I'll show you what I did for the capillaries in the shader I made for the gecko. I took the basic curvature map, and then I take one of the cellular patterns, change your blending mode to multiply, and then you get a cellular pattern based on the curvature of your geometry. And then you can change this however you like. I would probably change the scale to be a lot smaller. Change the contrast a bit. Maybe blur that a little bit. Then you get this cellular pattern. And then you can add a height map to it. And give it a little bumpiness. And change the roughness of it. And you get this nice little rough, bumpy pattern. Your little edges here, which is kind of nice looking, kind of like dinosaur skin looking thing. So there's a bunch of other generators, which are also incredibly helpful, which I use regularly. One of the main ones I use for a lot of environmental assets is the dirt generator, which is like instantaneous dirt. It does perfect dirt for everything. As long as you bake your maps, the dirt will come out perfect. So like, look at that. That's it does. That's based on the roughness that I already gave this map. Those default. I'll just increase that a little bit. You can mess with the levels of dirt. This is all procedural. So you can do something like this. Maybe I'll stick it under that map. And then you get this sort of grungy look to it, pretty much without any real effort, which is awesome. If you're making anything with metal, there's this other really awesome generator that is metal edgeware. I'll just take those off and make this super metallic, turn roughness all the way down, and the roughness a little higher for this, so it's like paint, like car paint ish. Yeah. Then you get this really interesting paint chippy sort of look to it, which is really nice. And you can adjust all of your various parts of it. This one. So this is my sort of rusty metal shader, and it doesn't actually have that many layers to it, but it's pretty straightforward the way I've got it working. Let's just disable all of these. So you start with a really, really basic, just gray garbage color. You rough it up with the darker color here, but you could actually change the height on if you wanted to break it up even further. Maybe even a little bit of the roughness. So you get broken up roughness here. And then I have a really basic rustiness with a little bit of edgeware here, which is being driven by I go into the mask. Curvature goes into a 3D Perlin noise, which is just a fill layer, which is the same way I made that cellular layer earlier. If you just go to a fill layer and type in Perlin. I always use the fractal version of Perlin noise. I don't know. I think this one's way better if you specifically need it to be soft, but fractal noise is always going to be better for you because it's you know, detailed at every level of detail. And that'll get you this right here. And then it is being driven into a dripping rust, which is another generator that looks very nice, but it's very, very subtle details. I don't think that one actually does anything. And then, actually, I don't think I have that one enabled at all. But yeah, all of this is very, very good because when you build out these shaders, you can adjust, like I build a lot of these procedural shaders to be adjusted based on project to project. So you can build sort of like a master shader that is adjusted per individual thing. Like if you had a ton of metal objects, you could build one sort of metal shader that was the like art style for all of them, and then you could go in and tweak it a little bit, like say, okay, I want this to be a little brighter or something. Sorry, I wanted this to be like a little brighter or something, and you could change it to like whatever you wanted. So this is one of my projects that I did for another class recently. This is a little like one of those cones on the side of the road that was all beaten up. And this was all built in Substance, in pretty much one UV. Just disable everything and show you pretty much how I did it. So this is a plasticky material. So I did end up using the thickness map for this. I masked these little tape things based on the geometry itself. So I used the paint tool, this here, and just if you use the paint tool, you can go here to polygon fill. You can fill specific polygons. So I just filled in these little areas, and they got me these little tape lines. Then I took that and I made what's called an anchor point, which is sort of like masked by this layer. And then in the layer above it, I added little hexagons based on that layer and made them a little rougher. I don't know why they look like that. That's just what cones look like. And then I did the same thing here and same there. And then I have this little roughness going on here, which is just a grunge map that's already in Substance Painter. It has a ton, like an absolute ton of grunges that I highly recommend you check out. That are all, you can control a lot about them. Yeah, that's just what's driving my height map here. Actually, wait, I don't think I even used that. Some of mine were disabled. This is the one that I used. This, yeah, it was Perlin Noise, which gave me the bumpy plasticky look. And then I have a bunch of scratches on the surface, which is based on one of the Kyle's brushes, which I use to just scratch the edges of this manually. And then I have a bunch of graffiti here, which I just built out with just like a marker tool. And then I have the dirt noise, which I ended up breaking up even further using a paint layer and one of Kyle's brushes that looks sort of has like a dirt mask. Let me switch to 3D. And then I just have the basic ambient occlusion to give it the game look. And this was something I was playing with, but I didn't actually go with, called Baked Lighting Stylized, which sometimes can look really cool with some models. It just gives it like this sunlight baked into it, but I didn't actually end up doing it. But yeah, that's sort of like a practical example of how Substance can be applied